The night Bumpy Johnson walked into the Apollo Theater and found two men he didn't invite standing in the wings, something shifted in Harlem that would never fully shift back. These weren't stagehands. They weren't managers. They were soldiers, quiet, armed, sent by people who believed Harlem was theirs to walk through whenever they pleased. Bumpy looked at them, said nothing loud, and within the hour, those men were gone. Not just from the theater. From every backstage corridor, every dressing room hallway, every shadow behind every curtain in that building. Gone. And the word went out across every family in New York. The Apollo is off limits. You don't send your people there. Not ever. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to understand what Harlem was and what the Apollo meant inside it. This wasn't just a neighborhood. By the 1960s, Harlem had been through decades of being squeezed by poverty, by neglect, by people from outside who came to take money out and leave nothing behind. And in the middle of all that, the Apollo Theater stood like something that couldn't be taken. It was the place where Ella Fitzgerald got her start. James Brown recorded one of the greatest live albums ever made, where Billie Holiday, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, where all of them had stood under those lights and given something real to an audience that needed it. The Apollo wasn't just entertainment. For the people of Harlem, it was proof. Proof that something they built, something that belonged to them, could be world-class, could be the best in the world. And no one understood that better than Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, the man everyone called Bumpy. Bumpy Johnson was not what most people picture when they imagine a man who controlled the streets. He read books, he wrote poetry, he had real conversations with real artists, and he meant them. He had grown up hard, done serious time in prison, and come back to Harlem understanding that the neighborhood needed more than just someone tough enough to hold a corner. It needed someone smart enough to build something. And by the time the 1960s arrived, Bumpy had built something that was genuinely complicated and genuinely powerful. He had relationships with the 5 families of New York, the Italian organized crime organizations that ran significant portions of the city's illegal economy. But he wasn't their employee. That distinction was everything to him. The arrangement that existed between Bumpy and the Italian families had developed over the years, and it was built on a kind of mutual calculation. The families understood that Harlem was Bumpy's territory, and that trying to operate there without him was more trouble than it was worth. Bumpy understood that the families controlled supply chains, political connections, and enforcement resources that he needed access to. So there was a peace, but it was a specific peace. The families could profit from Harlem, through the numbers business, through narcotics, through various arrangements, but they did it through Bumpy. He was the man in the middle, which meant the actual Italian presence in Harlem was meant to stay invisible. No soldiers walking the streets, no lieutenants setting up in Harlem establishments. The money flowed, but the men stayed out. That was the agreement. For a while it held. But agreements between powerful people in the criminal world have a particular weakness. When one side starts feeling like the other side needs them more than they're needed in return, the side that feels powerful starts testing. Small things first. A man sent to watch something who stays a little longer than he should. A message delivered in person instead of through the usual channels. Invisible boundaries get crossed so quietly that calling it a crossing feels like an overreaction. Until suddenly, the crossing is just the new normal, and the boundary no longer exists. This is what began happening in the early 1960s in Harlem. The Genovese family, which had long-standing interests in the area, began making their presence slightly more physical. And then, on a night that became something of a legend in the back rooms of Harlem, 2 of their men ended up backstage at the Apollo. What they were doing there depends on who you ask and which version of the story they heard. Some said they were there as muscle for a transaction happening that night, involving someone in the music business. Some said they came because the theater was hosting an event that drew a large, wealthy crowd, and someone thought it was an opportunity to make a connection. Some said it was simpler than that they came because they could, because they'd been testing and hadn't been stopped yet, and this was the next test. Whatever the reason, they were there. And when Bumpy found out, he moved quickly. The story of what happened next is one of those stories that circulated for years through the people who knew Bumpy, or knew people who knew him. He didn't send someone else. He went himself. He walked into the backstage area, and he had a very short conversation with the two men present. The content of that conversation, word for word, has been lost to time, but the result is documented clearly enough in the behavior that followed. Those men left. And within days, through whatever communication method was used between Bumpy and the families, a message had been received and acknowledged. The Apollo was sovereign ground. It was, from that point forward, categorically off-limits to anyone operating on behalf of the Italian families. The families could have pushed back. The Genovese family at that time was one of the most powerful criminal organizations in New York, and they had resources, connections, and a long history of enforcing their will with serious consequences. The fact that they accepted this particular line from Bumpy tells you something important. It tells you that Bumpy had cultivated a position that wasn't purely about street muscle. He had made himself genuinely necessary to the operations that profited the families in Harlem. Cutting him off or going to war with him over a backstage area would cost more than it would gain. And there was something else. Something that even the most calculating of the family leadership seemed to understand. The Apollo wasn't just a building. Making a move on it, or being seen to make a move on it, would mean something to Harlem that no amount of money could manage afterward. Bumpy understood the symbolism of the Apollo in a way that was probably beyond the full appreciation of anyone who hadn't grown up in Harlem and loved Harlem the way he did. He talked about it in terms that weren't typical for someone in his position. He said the theater was one of the few places in the neighborhood that belonged completely to the community, where the dignity of black artists was the whole point, and nothing compromised it. For him, Italian organized crime figures standing in those wings wasn't just a security concern or a territorial issue. It was a contamination. It was the street reaching into the one place that was supposed to be above the street, and he wasn't going to allow it. This is the piece of the story that gets lost when people focus only on the gangster elements of Bumpy Johnson's life. He operated in the criminal world, yes. He was not a clean man in the legal sense, and he would have been the first to say so. But he had a framework for what Harlem deserved that was genuinely moral, even when his methods weren't. He believed that the people of Harlem were owed certain things: protection, dignity, the ability to go to their own places without feeling the presence of outside forces that had come to take from them. The Apollo was the clearest symbol of that for him, and protecting it wasn't separate from his identity as someone who cared about Harlem. It was the same thing. The practical effect of Bumpy's decision radiated outward from the Apollo in ways that shaped the experience of the broader arts community in Harlem. Artists who performed at the theater knew, at least at the level of general reputation, that the backstage area was safe in a specific way. There were no figures back there who shouldn't be back there. No uncomfortable conversations were happening in corners. The space was clean. For musicians and performers who had spent careers navigating environments where that kind of cleanliness was not guaranteed, where managers owed debts to the wrong people, where promoters had to answer to figures nobody wanted to meet, this mattered. The Apollo had a reputation for being where you could just be an artist, and part of what maintained that reputation was Bumpy's quiet insistence on keeping it that way. The Lucchese family was also implicated in this story, though in a different way. Their interests in Harlem were somewhat different from the Genovese families, but they were present in the economy of the neighborhood, and they understood the same message. The Apollo was a line. It was not a place where the calculation of profit or leverage applied. Bumpy had drawn it and made it stick, and the line stayed drawn. Years later, people who had been around that world during that period spoke about it as an example of what Bumpy could do that most people in his position couldn't. He could make something permanent out of a decision, and he could make it stick, not through constant enforcement, but through the sheer weight of what he represented. What he represented was Harlem itself, in a way. Not officially, not in any way that could be written on a document or acknowledged in polite company. But the people of Harlem understood it, and the people outside Harlem who dealt with Harlem understood it. When Bumpy said something was how it was going to be in that neighborhood, the statement had a kind of authority behind it that wasn't reducible to threat. It was built from decades of being present, being known, being someone whose word had been tested and held. The families operated in many parts of New York, and they had relationships with many people in those parts, but most of those relationships were transactional. The relationship between Bumpy and Harlem was not transactional. That difference made him a different kind of partner and a different kind of problem. He was also aging in this period, and he knew it. Bumpy Johnson had health problems throughout the 1960s, and he would die in 1968, collapsing in a Harlem restaurant while having a meal. He lived his last years knowing that the world he had navigated for decades was changing, and that his ability to hold any of it together was finite. And yet there's no evidence that the Apollo situation was ever revisited after he made his position clear. The line held through the rest of his life, and remained, by reputation, after, which is to say, that what he built there wasn't dependent on his continued presence to enforce it. He had made it into something that the world around it had simply incorporated as fact. That's a rare kind of power. Most power operates through ongoing presence. You have to keep showing up, keep reminding people, keep enforcing the terms. Bumpy had done something different with the Apollo. He had turned a decision into a permanent feature of the landscape, such that the idea of violating it felt not just dangerous but somehow wrong, like trying to build something in the middle of a road. Technically possible, but so obviously not how things are done that most people won't do it simply because it isn't done. The story of why Bumpy blacklisted Italian operators from the Apollo backstage area is, at its core, a story about what happens when someone who came from a place loves that place enough to protect it, even against the alliances that made them powerful. Bumpy needed the families to operate the way he operated. He wasn't naive about that. But he knew that every relationship has a point at which the cost of maintaining it exceeds what the relationship is worth. The Apollo was that point for him. There was no negotiation available, no compromise to be found, no version of the arrangement where he could accept their physical presence in that space. Because that space was not a piece of territory in the ordinary sense. It was a statement about what Harlem was, what it was capable of, what it had already given the world, what it deserved to keep being without the shadow of someone else's business falling across it. He made that clear once, firmly and without spectacle, and the rest of his life the answer was no, not yet. Not in a different way, just no. And the Apollo Theater continued to be the Apollo Theater, the place where the music was everything, where the audience gave no mercy to anything less than the best, where Harlem showed the world who it was, without anyone standing in the wings who had no business being there. That is what Bumpy Johnson protected, and that is why, even among people who have complicated feelings about everything else he was and everything else he did, the story of the Apollo is told with something that sounds unmistakably like respect.